Greetings, viewers. I am the Shapeshifter, and welcome to the top 5 scary war stories as told by soldiers. Now, obviously, each soldier claims that each story is 100% true. I will let you decide what your own belief is. Coming in at number 5, the French Wraith of World War I. A British soldier writes home to his parents about an encounter with a mysterious creature that him and his fellow soldiers witnessed in the middle of the night. Now, I could not find a written story of this encounter, but I did happen to find an audio recording of someone reading the letter. This person will remain anonymous for legal reasons, but the story is here for you to enjoy.
Dear Mother and Father, the autumn is a very bad one. The rain is incessant and it's very hard to believe I shall see you again. The food is good this week. Last week we ran out of biscuits and ended up with just soup for 4 days. But our spirits are higher this week. I'm not allowed to tell you very much, of course, but there are new companies arriving who are having success against the Germans. What I want to tell you is a strange tale, and I trust you will believe me. I've been sleeping all right, and I'm of sound mind. I feel I must tell someone, in case I do not return to tell the tale. 3 nights ago, I was on night watch duty from midnight to 4 o'clock. The German lines are only perhaps 200 yards from our trench, and with my binoculars, I could see them moving about, their lanterns glowing. All seemed quiet, but at just before 2, a commotion could be heard. A German shouted in pain, and then more voices joined the clamour. My commanding officer woke at the noise and ordered that a flare be sent up. He feared an attack. Under the brilliant phosphorus glare, I saw a sight that I hope I shall never see again. A great, dark figure was moving along the German trench, perhaps 20 feet tall. Whether it was in the shape of man or beast, I cannot say. It had arms, I think, and legs, but how many I cannot say. It seemed to be made of smoke or billows of dark dust, always shifting and twisting like knots of matted hair. My commanding officer swore an oath at the sight and sent up another flare. Now we could see clearly. The boys in the trench with me were dumbfounded. A few could not watch. But I saw it all. This creature, or wraith, or whatever it was, seemed to lift German soldiers from their trench one by one and pick them apart as if they were spiders in the hands of a schoolboy. The popping sound, the delicate rip of flesh in the otherwise dead, silent night, will live with me forever. Limbs dropped into the mud with a splash. A head would fall under the light of the flare, a shadow rushing to meet it as it fell heavily into the filth. The beast was working methodically left to right, apparently clearing the entire trench, taking the torsos that had dismembered into its maw where they slipped obscenely into the wreaths of its darkness. It seemed to shrink and grow from time to time, never still, never one shape, always sliding indecently along the earth, ever moving, never still, but silent. Utterly silent it was. The only sounds the gurgles and screams of the German troops. I almost felt sorry for them. Were we to be next? Suddenly it all stopped. The shapeless thing lurched to the right, out of the light of our flares, and disappeared into the darkness. It was done. All that was left was the commotion of the Germans moving about in their trench, frantic cries and moans drifting across the damp air. We looked at each other, hardly believing what we'd seen. Our commanding officer ordered us to tell no one, and we have done as we've been told. I write this to you in the belief that someone should know what I saw, and in the hope that the regimental censors allow my words to reach England, even if they must remain secret for now. I send you all my love and hope, and pray that you never have to experience the sight I saw this last week. We fear very much that the creature might return. Does it know or care which side of the lines we're on? Does it have even a base intelligence? Is it of this world or another? I miss you all so very much, and although I'm due leave before Christmas, I think perhaps I shall not see you in England again. We hear such tales from the front. In hope, and with my most heartfelt sincerity, Alfred.
Coming in at number 4, an interesting tale from World War II. A Ghost B-17 bomber lands itself at an Allied airbase. On November 23rd, 1944, something happened at an Allied base in Kortenberg, Belgium, that still hasn't been fully explained. On that day, a B-17G bomber was closing in on 3 Allied anti-aircraft gun positions and looked like it was going to crash right into them. The soldiers on the ground could see that the bomber's landing gear was down, and because of the way it was flying, they assumed the plane had been damaged or some of the crew were wounded. It was coming in fast, and the 35,000-pound bomber was falling from the sky right on top of them. They hit the deck and braced for impact as they cursed the pilot of the plane. The bomber barely cleared the gun positions and smacked into the ground like a falling rock. The extreme force of the impact caused the giant bomber to start bouncing, which led to the plane getting off kilter and one of the wings smashed into the earth. Pieces of the propeller were violently thrown through the air like meteors as they spun to the ground. 100 feet from the gun position, the lumbering bomber finally came to a stop. The engines that worked kept running, and witnesses held their breath. They waited, and waited, and waited some more, but no crew emerged from the flying fortress. Soldiers on the ground began wondering, where on earth is the crew? The men on the ground certainly didn't know what to think, and definitely didn't know how to help. No emergency call from the plane was announced, and the men in the gun positions were worried from the start. 5 minutes went by and no crew emerged, then 10 minutes, then 15 without a sign of life. After all, this was World War II, and sneaky backhanded tactics have been employed by both sides. The plane stood eerily in the field. The anticipation began to grow as 3 remaining engines continued spinning their propellers. After 20 minutes, finally, a British major named John V. Crisp decided to investigate. But even Crisp was nervous and extremely cautious in his search. The anticipation continued to grow as the 3 functional engines continued spinning their propellers. Still no movement, and still no sign of the crew. Time was of the essence, so Major Crisp began searching the exterior of the plane. It wasn't because he was looking for something, but because he wasn't an airman, and it took him a minute to figure out how to get inside. Major Crisp was an officer in the British Army, and he camped nearby along with the rest of his unit. He wasn't an airman, as he was in the Army, so it took him a few minutes to locate the entry hatch below the fuselage. He was alone when he entered, and was about to discover something incredible about this airplane. Major Crisp was apprehensive in his search, as he expected to find dead or dying men from the air crew. Why else would no one exit the plane? Major Crisp pressed on through the thin fuselage that usually held most of the crew. The Major found some half-eaten chocolate bars and later commented that evidence of fairly recent occupation was everywhere. But even with the cramped fuselage of the B-17, he couldn't find anyone. What he did find were 12 parachute packs that hadn't been used, which was odd, because his search revealed that there was not a single soul aboard the aircraft. Major Crisp remained the only person on board while he continued his search for clues as to what happened to the crew. He made his way to the cockpit and hadn't noticed anything suspicious about the yoke. In other words, the plane had somehow not only managed to fly itself, but land itself too. After some trial and error, Major Crisp managed to turn off the engines on the airplane. He also made his way to the aircraft log and noticed some words scribbled there. But where was the crew? The ensuing investigation would have Allied forces baffled, and the word of the Phantom Fortress, as Stars and Stripes magazine called it, began to circulate. Alarm over the incident was shot through a chain of command, and an investigation started immediately. As commanders feared the worst for the crew, to make matters even worse, the complicated B-17 that landed itself didn't even have a name. Major Chris reported the incident to his superiors, and a team was sent out to investigate. Investigators arrived at the bomber and found the plane's serial number, and this enabled commanders in the 8th Air Force to identify the plane as part of the 91st Bomber Group, which was a contingent of B-17s that operated out of East Anglia, England. The plane had indeed taken off from there with its crew, but now they were gone. Once the squadron plane was identified, questions began to swirl around the crew and what became of them. The plane was littered with evidence that they were on board at some point. The cover of the Sperry bomb site was removed, which was typical when a bombardier was on a bombing run. The parachutes were a bigger mystery. Even though they were on board, sometime later all of the men were located. All 10 of them were alive and well at an airbase in Belgium. Investigators were absolutely baffled by what they found, and dug into the mystery further. The B-17's mission was to bomb the Luna oil refinery in Mersburg, Germany, which was a dangerous target given its location in eastern Germany. By that point in the war, the Allies had been pounding the German targets around the clock. The British bombed German targets by night, while American bombers bombed during the day. Because bombing accuracy was such a problem, American warplanners insisted on daylight missions for more precise strikes. This made American bombers far more vulnerable, and upon Chris' research of the aircraft, he found a log in the navigator station that read, "Bad Flak." Lieutenant Harold R. Diebold was the pilot of the B-17, and even though the plane was new, he was an experienced pilot. The bomber made the journey to Germany just fine until the group commenced its bombing run. For some reason, the plane was unable to keep altitude with the rest of the group. That's when the German anti-aircraft opened up on the low-flying bomber and scored 2 hits. The bomb bay sustained a direct hit, and by some miracle, it didn't set off the bombs. "We had been hit in the bomb bay," said Lieutenant Diebold. "I'll be darned if I know why the bombs didn't explode." An engine was also reportedly damaged by a flak hit, despite the fact that when the plane was on approach for landing, all 4 engines were still functioning. The crew knew they were in trouble while flying low, alone and over enemy territory. The weather had been terrible all day, and the plane experienced a rough flight through towering white clouds. The weather in Europe, like the political climate, was terrible in 1944. And with that, the engine knocked out, and a malfunctioning bomb bay, Lieutenant Diebold decided to abandon the bombing run and head back to base in East Anglia, England. Lieutenant Diebold added as much power as he could to the engines, but his plane continued to slowly lose altitude. He then ordered the crew to jettison loose equipment. They did as ordered, but the plane continued to fall. The crew held out hope that the plane would make it back to their airbase, but with each moment that passed, their situation looked worse and worse. Then suddenly, a second engine stopped turning, leaving Lieutenant Diebold no choice. He was going to have to give the order to ditch. He pointed the plane on a course towards Brussels and ordered the crew to get their parachutes ready. The plane struggled to keep its altitude once it was hit, and pilot Harold R. Diebold turned the plane around to head back to England. When the second engine became compromised and stopped working, Diebold knew the plane would never make it across England. He then set a course to the Brussels. The crew bailed of the plane, and Diebold was the last to leave. He set the plane on autopilot and jumped. They anticipated that the plane would succumb to its wounds and crash into the ground. Reports of a plane flying by itself were not unheard of in World War II, but a B-17 on 2 engines had very little chance of remaining in the air. The crew watched the plane fly away, but thick clouds of covered smoke caused them to lose sight of the bomber. Unbeknownst to the crew, the plane was still in the air when they hit the ground. It's pretty incredible that the plane flew for miles on its own, and only half engine capacity. But that seems to be what happened. The captain reported that he and his crew ditched the aircraft near Brussels, Belgium for investigators. This was anything but a neat and tidy explanation. There were still many discrepancies that still needed to be solved. There was a crew without parachutes, a plane that made it miles on wounded engines, and discrepancies in the investigation report. All unclear and pale in comparison to the most incomprehensible part of this all. The odds that an unmanned plane would make it that far and then land by itself are no less than impossible. Of all the places, angles it could have come at, approaches and potential touchdown spots. It's mind-blowing that the plane landed as though it knew how to land itself, which any pilot will tell you is preposterous. Part of the mystery surrounds the question of why there were conflicting reports between what the soldiers on the ground saw after the plane landed and the crew's version of events before they aborted their mission. The crew reported that in the course of their mission, one engine was destroyed and one quit. However, the soldiers on the ground reported that all 4 engines were intact. When the plane made its approach, though both counts were recorded in the official investigation, the contradiction was never resolved. Was there a hole in the crew's story? Another discrepancy that was never really resolved was the fact that the crew had reported that they were struck by enemy fire, which is why they felt it was necessary to abort the plane. However, Major Crisp and the other soldiers reported no physical damage on the plane. However, given the rough, unpiloted landing of the aircraft, one possible explanation for the discrepancy is that Crisp and the other soldiers were not trained to identify the difference between damage from enemy fire compared to the damage sustained by the plane due to its rough landing. If the crew's story is true, it's bizarre that Major Crisp found all parachutes on board. While it is plausible that they would decide to abandon the plane if they believed it incurred too much damage, it's hard to understand how they evacuated the plane without parachutes. Maybe Major Crisp got it wrong, and maybe the soldiers on the ground did too, but the fact remains that the B-17 managed to land itself. The B-17 was a very tough airplane and could sustain considerable amount of punishment. Lieutenant Diebold may have felt he was doing what best for his crew, but his plane was determined to get them all home. Of all the ways this incredible story could have ended, it seems that the way it did was the best-case scenario. After all, the crew made it out safely, and the damaged plane didn't cause any further destruction as it made its way back toward Earth. Needless to say, there were many stories during the war that didn't end so well. But the mysteries of World War II don't end there, as several crews have encountered incidents without explanation. Coming in at number 3, the real Battle of Los Angeles. In the frantic weeks that followed the Pearl Harbor attack, many Americans believed that enemy raids on the continental United States were imminent. On December 9th, 1941, unsubstantiated reports of approaching aircraft had caused a minor invasion panic in New York City, and sent stock prices tumbling on the West Coast. Inexperienced pilots and radar men had mistaken fishing boats, logs, and even whales for Japan warships. Tensions were high, and they only grew after the U.S. Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, warned that American cities should be prepared to accept occasional blows from enemy forces. Just a few days later, on February 23, 1942, a Japanese submarine surfaced off the coast of Santa Barbara, California, and hurled over a dozen artillery shells at an oil field and refinery. While the attack inflicted no casualties and caused only minor damage, it marked the first time that the mainland United States had been bombed during World War II. The day after the oil field raid, paranoia and itchy trigger fingers combined to produce one of the most unusual home front incidents of the war. It began on the evening of February 24th, 1942, when naval intelligence instructed units on the California coast to steel themselves for a potential Japanese attack. All remained calm for the next few hours, but shortly after 2 a.m. on February 25th, military radar picked up what appeared to be an enemy contact some 120 miles west of Los Angeles. Air raid sirens sounded, and a citywide blackout was put into effect. Within minutes, troops had manned anti-aircraft guns and began sweeping the skies with searchlights. It was just after 3 a.m. when the shooting started. Following reports of an unidentified object in the skies, troops in Santa Monica unleashed a barrage of anti-aircraft and .50 caliber machine gun fire. Before long, many of the city's other coastal defenses weapons had joined in. Powerful searchlights from countless stations stabbed the sky with brilliant probing fingers, the Los Angeles Times wrote, while anti-aircraft batteries dotted the heavens with beautiful, if sinister, orange bursts of shrapnel. Chaos reigned over the next several minutes. It appeared that Los Angeles was under attack. Yet many of those who looked skyward saw nothing but a smoke and a glare of ack-ack fire. Imagination could have easily disclosed many shapes in the sky in the midst of that weird symphony of noise and color. Coastal Artillery Corps Colonel John G. Murphy later wrote, but Corps Detachment disclosed no planes of any type in the sky, friendly or enemy. For others, however, the threat appeared to be very real. Reports poured in from across the city describing Japanese aircraft flying in formation, bombs falling, and enemy paratroopers. There was even a claim of a Japanese plane crash landing in the streets of Hollywood. I could barely see the planes, but they were up there all right. A coastal artilleryman named Charles Patrick later wrote in a letter, I could see 6 planes, and shells were bursting all around them. Naturally, all of us fellows were anxious to get our 2 cents worth in, and when the command came in, everybody cheered like a son of a gun. The barrage eventually continued for over an hour. By the time the final all-clear order was given later that morning, Los Angeles artillery batteries had pumped over 1,440 anti-aircraft rounds into the sky. It was only in the light of day that the American military units made a puzzling discovery. There appeared to have been no enemy attack. Although reports were conflicting and every effort is being made to ascertain the facts, it is clear that no bombs were dropped and no planes were shot down, read a statement from the Army's Western Defense Command. Ironically, the only damage during the battle had come from friendly fire. Anti-aircraft shrapnel rained down across the city, shattering windows and ripping through buildings. One dud careened into a Long Beach golf course, and several residents and their homes partially destroyed by 3-inch artillery shells. While there were no serious injuries from the shootout, it was reported that at least 5 people had died as a result of heart attacks and car accidents that occurred during the extended blackout. In a preview of the hysteria that would soon accompany the Japanese internment, authorities also arrested some 20 Japanese Americans for allegedly trying to signal the non-existent aircraft. Over the next few days, government and media outlets issued contradictory reports on what later became known as the Battle of Los Angeles. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox dismissed the firefight as a false alarm brought on by jittery nerves, but as the Secretary of War Henry Stimson echoed Army brass in saying that at least 15 planes had buzzed the city. He even advanced the provocative theory that the Phantom fighters might have been commercial aircraft operated by enemy agents, hoping to strike fear into the public. Stimson later backpedaled his claims, but there was still the matter of the thousands of military personnel and civilians who claimed to have seen aircraft in the skies over L.A. According to an editorial in the New York Times, some eyewitnesses had spied a big floating object resembling a balloon, while others had spotted anywhere from 1 plane to several dozen. The more the whole incident of the early morning of February 25th in Los Angeles Dick Street is examined, the article read, the more incredible it becomes. While it's likely that the Battle of Los Angeles was only a mirage, it was still a chilling reminder of the vulnerability that many Americans felt at the beginning of the war. The Japanese would later hatch several schemes to attack the American mainland, including launching over 9,000 explosive-laden fire balloons. Yet none of them ever produced the level of mass hysteria that accompanied the Phantom shootout over Los Angeles. Even at the time, many journalists noticed that it was fitting that the incident had taken place in the home of the film industry. In an article from March 1942, the New York Times wrote that as the world's permanent fabricator of make-believe, Hollywood appeared to have played host to a battle that was just another illusion. Now, the second and first spot will both be taken by a few stories told by U.S. soldiers stationed in the Middle East. Starting with a soldier whose unit was apparently plagued by a mysterious phantom that would appear on the outskirts of their camp and vanish in the blink of an eye. The first time it appeared was a little after dusk. A couple hundred yards from their position, one of the men described as a random private told the others that there was a person out in the wilderness, just standing there. The witness looked, and at first couldn't see anything, but after a moment could make out a dark blob in the vague shape of a person. The sergeant apparently was called over and saw it too. When asked where the figure had come from, the private explained that it had just popped up. Whoever was out there was just standing, motionless, with its back to the soldiers. The witness described the eerie scene and what happened next. So we watched this person for 3 hours, who just stands there motionless with its back to us. You could put optics on and see it was a person, adult male, average height and build. Best part, we borrowed a thermal monocular, and this fucker doesn't show up on it. Zero fucking heat signature. Then randomly, just poof, gone. Random private spends the next 6 weeks telling everyone about the ghost we saw. Around 6 months later, the same witness was out on patrol when 2 of his units reported seeing 2 figures standing on the top of a berm a couple hundred yards away. Anticipating an enemy IED, improvised explosive device, they stopped the vehicle and examined the figures, which appeared to be men just standing there with their backs to them. They were motionless and would not respond when called to. Just like the strange phantom previously seen 6 months earlier, the lieutenant called it in, and some of the men got out to go investigate. The witness would explain what happened next. We dismount. Lieutenant calls over. Terp asks if he knows what's up. Terp gives a blank stare and shrugs. Lieutenant decides we should go have a look-see and do some hearts and mind shit. I stay in the truck, which feels like 140 fucking degrees. 20 minutes goes by. Lieutenant comes back with a weird look on his face and says, "We're out of here." Later that day, I asked another guy what the fuck happened. He says they got within 50 yards of the aforementioned persons, and presto, gone. I asked, "What do you mean, gone?" And he just looks at me with this blank stare and says, "Gone. They were there, and they weren't. Weird, huh?" In another account, a Marine who served in Afghanistan and Yemen from 2009 to 2013 relates an odd experience. One evening at 1 a.m., the witness had just finished setting up a patrol base with 4 members of his squad while the other 17 men slept. In front of the patrol base, a huge open field, and to the left was a rather spookily an Afghan cemetery. As the witness was looking out over the field on watch duty, he claims that a rock came hurtling through the air to land at his feet. Thinking this to be peculiar, he peered out into the darkness over the field, which was wide open with no blind spots or hiding places. But he couldn't see anyone there, nor any movement. As he was looking, another rock reportedly was tossed in his direction from the field. The witness put on a light and night vision goggles, but could see nothing. The night was completely quiet, and the field was totally empty. Yet another rock would be lobbed at him as he tried to figure out what was going on, and the whole thing was quite unnerving, the Marine would say of the eerie incident. At this point, I'm kind of freaked out. This happened right after my team leader died, so I was freaked out, and nothing to rule out would throw rocks at me because no one was there. Many more stories to follow, if it is your wish, my viewers. I hope you have enjoyed these creepy accounts of war stories told by soldiers. If you wish for me to tell more spooky stories, war-related or otherwise, please let me know down in the comments section. Also, don't forget to like the video to show your support. I shall see you all in the next video.